Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining Beyond Plastic's webinar on reusables for the restaurant industry. I'm Katie Berry, and I'm a Beyond Plastic champion. When the Beyond Plastic team came together in 2021 as a result of Best and KBB's desire to collaborate on the issue of single-use plastics, we quickly realized that just replacing single-use plastic items with other single-use items was a seemingly easy solution. But in the long run, it would not reduce litter, and it would not minimize the environmental impact, and ultimately it would cost businesses more over time. Replacing would not solve the main issue that needs to be tackled. The plastic industry along the whole pipeline from raw materials to consumer waste is poisoning the planet environmentally, and it's making humans sick. Many people do not realize that they estimate all of us are ingesting about 5 grams of plastic a week. That's roughly the size of a credit card. Most of this is ingested when we eat food that has been in contact with plastic. This bioaccumulation in our systems is connected to diseases that are commonplace in Bermuda. So what to do about it? Well, there's legislation, yeah, but that doesn't always mean success. Just think of the sugar tax. We need individuals, businesses, and the government to come together and make changes for success. We certainly know that modern Bermudian life is busy, sometimes too busy, and that we all love convenience. This led us as a team to the realization that the campaign really needed to foster innovation to encourage the island to embrace new models, such as refill and reuse. These models will help create the best long-term solution. And ultimately, it would also be the most environmental, healthier, and cost-effective solution in the long term. So the team at Beyond Plastic has done an awful lot of research and talked to a lot of people worldwide. And today's webinar is the result of our desire to facilitate change in order to move and support the move away from single-use plastic in Bermuda. We really believe change brings opportunity. I'm really excited today to be joined by Ellie Moss and Dagny Tucker of Perpetual Use. Perpetual partners with cities, reuse and service providers, and other stakeholders to implement immersive reuse systems that eliminate single-use disposables, starting with foodware. The team at Perpetual are working with several small cities to implement city-scale, open-loop, reusable foodware systems. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's what we kind of think that might work for Bermuda. So through consultation with the key stakeholders, they thoughtfully create a system that works with people and businesses that use it. We're hoping that you might consider what Ellie and Dagny have to say today and maybe work with them to design your own system if you're a restaurant group, or maybe we need a Bermuda-wide system that all restaurants can access. I'm not sure what the answer is because I don't know your businesses like you do, but I do know that Ellie and the Perpetual team can help. In a moment, I will hand over to Ellie, but I just wanted to give you an overview of how the webinar will proceed. Ellie is going to talk to you about what Perpetual is doing and what might work in Bermuda. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A, and on the panel will be Ellie and Dagny of Perpetual. They will also be joined by myself and my colleagues at Beyond Plastic, Eric Hetzel and Tony Prentice. Eric is a Beyond Plastic team leader and knows everything there is to know about plastic. And Tony works alongside Eric with local wholesalers and restaurants to look at how to replace the single-use plastics currently being used and what might be feasible in the future. If you have questions you would like answered in the Q&A, please click the Q&A on the menu bar, which is usually at the bottom in Zoom, at the bottom of your webinar screen. Please avoid using the chat options for your questions. There will be 2 short questionnaires. This helps us work out what we need to do to help support you. The first questionnaire will be before I hand over to Ellie in a second, and the other will be at the end of the webinar. Joe, can you start the first questionnaire? this is really helpful information for us. So thank you, everybody. And there's still a little bit more time to answer if you haven't finished, don't worry. But this really helps us make sure that we are getting it right where all of you are concerned, and that the campaign can support who we need to support. Just a few more seconds. I think that is probably everybody. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ellie. Ellie?
Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm just delighted to see so many people who have joined today to speak with us. I'm really excited. I'm not sure, did we want to share the results with the group or no?
Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. It was more for internal, but we can share the results. Shall I do that?
I think it'd be nice for people to see, yeah, how they answered, just so we all have a sense of who's on the call.
Okay, great.
Great. So it looks like everyone should be able to see the results now. What I'm seeing is that we had 24 out of 26 people say they are supportive of reducing Bermuda's use of single-use plastics in the food service industry. So not 100%, but a good share. You know, people generally have heard of reuse schemes before, but not everyone. So we'll definitely take that into account as we talk through our presentation today. And then it's super helpful to see which area of business folks are in. So mostly restaurants and then other, with some representation from supermarkets, food trucks, coffee shops, and wholesalers. So that's super helpful. Thanks everyone for sharing your answers in the poll. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and take a moment to introduce myself and my colleague Dagny. So my name is Ellie Moss. Thanks again to Beyond Plastics Bermuda for inviting us to speak to you all. We're really excited to share some of the thinking that we've been doing and the work that we're doing to see if it may be of service to you all. I am based in Tampa, Florida. One caveat on my side is we are getting ready to evacuate for a hurricane. So I might have children and dogs in the background at some point. Hopefully it won't be too disruptive, but I know you all have been through this kind of thing before. So hoping all of you stayed safe through Fiona, and we'll stay safe through the rest of this hurricane season. I've been spending about 15 years on sustainability, in the last 5 years in particular on plastic waste solutions. And looking at the problem through a range of lenses. So working with large companies, working with nonprofits, helping impact investors devise strategies for using investment to address marine debris and plastic waste and pollution. So I've seen this problem from many different angles, and I'm really excited about the potential for reuse as a solution. So that's what we'll talk about today. And I want to invite my colleague Dagny to introduce herself as well, right here at the beginning.
Hi, everyone. Also a pleasure to be here today. I am way across the pond in Paris, France. And my background, I've spent about the last 15 or 20 years at the intersection of design, business, and sustainability, and really a big focus on the circular economy over the last 10 years. I founded a company that provides reusable foodware in 2015, so quite a while ago, providing open network, tech-enabled reusable foodware in New York City, then out in California, as well as Colorado. Multiple city launches, lots of stakeholders, and about 7 years of experience designing from the ground up, building, implementing, and running those programs. I'm happily back to the things I love to do, which is the design side of figuring out how we solve the challenges in circular systems generally, but in foodware specifically, and happy to be doing the design for Perpetual now, as my company happily goes to someone who wants to grow the business alone. So looking really forward to speaking with you today in Bermuda.
Awesome, thanks, Dagny. So Perpetual is a nonprofit, and Perpetual partners at the city or potentially country level to design and support implementation of reuse systems, starting with foodware. So I just want to be clear from the beginning, we are not a company selling a solution. We are a nonprofit that facilitates a process to design solutions that then give communities the chance to tell reuse service providers what they want in a very specific and thoughtful way, so that those service providers can deliver a service that has been thoughtfully designed. But we are not selling a particular product or solution. We are a nonprofit that believes this needs to happen, and we are trying to fill a gap that we've identified in the space of actually going from reuse sounds interesting to how could this actually work at a city level. So I know we've already started to introduce the idea of reuse, but I just think it's always helpful to start with just at an intuitive level, common sense, like what makes more sense? Should we be, taking maybe renewable or maybe non-renewable resources, moving them around the world, using them for 15 minutes, throwing them away, and then needing to dispose of them, whether that's through incineration or recycling or other things like that, and then just doing that again and again and again and again and again, sort of indefinitely, versus bringing reusable items one time to a place where they can then be used, collected, washed and sanitized and redistributed. Intuitively, I think we all know that it seems to make more sense to use things as many times as we can, as long as there's a way to do that, efficiently. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today is, does that actually work? In our experience, and from all the work that we have done, both as Perpetual and also prior to Perpetual, many of us, have been in the reuse space for many years prior to this particular endeavor. We have found that reusable foodware systems are, I think, most importantly, better for businesses. They actually give you the chance to give your customers a choice on something that consumers are actually really interested in and focused on. They reduce supply chain disruption, vulnerability. So I know that during COVID, folks have had both an increased desire to use disposables for, hygiene, theater, and other potentially viable, valuable reasons. But COVID and other disruptions have also made it harder sometimes to get what you need. And so reusable systems can address that in a meaningful way. And reuse actually brings customers back. And you might think, well, what if they can return it anywhere? Are they still going to, bring it back to my place of business, or is it still going to result in more business for me? And what we found is the answer is yes, that actually people do make more return trips when they have a reusable item to return, even if they don't have to bring it back to a specific restaurant. We believe, and what we have found in seeing this happen on the ground for many years now, is that reuse is actually better for customers too. You heard Katie talking at the beginning of this conversation about how disposable foodware, and plastic in particular, is exposing us to toxic substances. That's true for plastic. It's true for some compostables as well. So it's something that we're really conscious of, is making sure that any reusable solution would minimize exposure to toxic substances and would avoid that exposure completely from disposables. Reusables are nicer to use. People like them. They feel good. It feels good to drink out of something, or eat really nice food out of something that's not about to sort of collapse on you or leak on you, or it's kind of flimsy and it's just not a great experience. I think we often think about sustainability as requiring trade-offs, but I think in this case, actually, the disposability requires some trade-offs. We've been willing to trade off some amount of convenience for kind of a lower level experience of enjoying food and beverage. And so this is a way to flip the script on that and elevate the experience of your customers. And we know that customers want to feel good about this. Nobody's feeling good about the pile of takeout containers in their trash. And then better for Bermuda, the less waste you create, the less waste you have to manage. You're reducing the cost of bringing stuff in, you're reducing the cost of managing it once it's there. And we've seen surveys that show something like 87% of tourists want sustainable choices. So sort of there are eco-conscious tourists and visitors who will see this as a real bonus, and it puts Bermuda in a position of being a leader. We know that people want solutions. In some of the work that we've done on the sort of intention behavior gap, I want to do X, but you don't end up changing your behavior. one of the biggest problems we've seen is that people don't actually have meaningful choices. So it's really hard to change your behavior when it requires you to sort of be better than human and remember to sort of bring all your own containers all the time and carry them around with you. And you know, there's a lot of extra work required from consumers to make the truly best choice. But people are genuinely looking for solutions. And I think people are willing to work a little bit harder, but within reason. Businesses are wanting to provide customers with solutions. They want to give people an experience that they feel really good about. And so the question then becomes how, like, we recognize that it's hard. It's really hard to do this as an individual person or as an individual business. And so then what can we do? This is the reusable foodware ecosystem once it's fully implemented. And I think this picture is helpful for a couple of reasons. One is it starts to show you the flow. So you can see starting in the bottom left, you know, the breakfast meal, you're getting a coffee cup, you're getting a smoothie, whatever you're getting, you're getting it, you're using it, you're returning it, it goes on its journey to get washed and restocked somewhere else. And that continues through lunch, it continues through dinner. People are purchasing food or beverage in one place, consuming them somewhere else, maybe returning them in the third place. You can do it all in the same place, but you can also do it wherever you happen to need to be. I think the first thing that may jump out at you from this picture is that there's no world in which this is set up by any individual company. It's just too much coordination. You know, in order to have the system actually work really well and be cost efficient and environmentally effective, you need the shared infrastructure and you need the sort of rules of engagement between different players for how you're going to interact and how things are going to flow through the system and how we make sure everyone's business needs are met, how all the consumers' needs are met, and how the system can function well. We know this can happen, but it won't happen by accident. It won't happen just, you know, sort of piecemeal here and there. And so this is really what Perpetual exists to help with, is to bring all these different pieces together and do that intentional design process so that you can create a system that really meets the needs of the community and puts the community in a position of making that decision and creating the solution together. We think about 4 key requirements for any reuse system. As I said, none of these are things that are going to happen by accident. These are all things that have to be consciously planned and imagined as you go through the process. And then the decisions throughout the design process have to reflect the community's will in each of these areas. So first of all, it has to be economically viable. We believe that what that looks like is that it has to be cost neutral to users. So it doesn't cost consumers anything. You could use like a deposit system or, you know, other systems that can create financial incentives to return things. But once people have done what they're supposed to do, it should be cost neutral to them. We believe that these systems must be comparable to the cost of disposables, or at least to some disposables. You know, it's very difficult to compete with something like styrofoam, where you're paying, you know, fractions of a penny for every unit. But for businesses that have already made a choice to go to a more sustainable material, which might be at a higher price point, a reuse system can absolutely be competitive with those price points. And we believe, of course, that it has to be self-sustaining over time. We are really clear that a solution is not a solution unless it can continue indefinitely over time. So it is not going to do anyone good to spend a bunch of time setting something up that's just going to sort of fall apart over time. And so it's important to be really thoughtful about the economics up front and to make sure you plan for the long-term viability of the program, and that it can support itself and it doesn't require sort of endless subsidies and things like that. Environmentally beneficial. So anyone who has studied sort of the disposable versus reusable question, you may have looked at life cycle assessments. And what's interesting right now is that there's a lot of life cycle assessments out there. These are, you know, analyses that compare the environmental impact of one option to the environmental impact of another option in a pretty detailed and data-driven way. They have many flaws. One of them is that as part of doing it, you create a lot of assumptions, which may or may not really reflect reality. And you can often engineer, you know, outcomes that are not truly objective. So you may have seen LCAs that were done by disposables manufacturers who show definitively that you'd have to reuse something 1 million times for it to ever be better than a disposable. I'm exaggerating, but sometimes it's 100 or 200 times that they sort of show, oh, the burden of this item is too high. You may also have seen LCAs from reusable promoters, and these LCAs show, actually, it's not so hard, as long as you have X, Y, and Z, it can be great. And I think the point here is that reuse can be better, and it can be a lot better, but it does need to be designed to be better. You need to be thoughtful about the greenhouse gas emissions of logistics and washing, and you need to be really careful about getting everything back. The worst case scenario with reuse is that you create a lot of durable trash. And of course, that's very much contrary to what we're trying to accomplish. And so it's just another underline for why the design process is so important, is because you need to make sure that you're actually designing a system that will be better at the end of the day. We find it to be really critical to be inclusive, to ensure that the design ensures the equitability and accessibility of the system, to make sure the system works for everyone and that everyone can use it with minimal barriers. And then finally, healthy and safe, and this is really, again, connecting back to what Katie emphasized, is that there are real health issues coming from our exposure to plastics in our daily lives. This is one area where it should be relatively easy to avoid those by swapping our disposable plastics and other toxic substances for materials that are actually going to be healthy and safe. And of course, we also need to ensure that the hygiene is effective and that we are getting containers as clean as they need to be and returned to restaurants clean. I've mentioned our team a few times. I want to just give you a sense of who we are. So you've met Dagny and me. We also have just some other wonderful, it just so happens that we're mostly women at the moment, wonderful folks who have a lot of great experience on reuse. I won't sort of go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to emphasize, we are a group of professionals who have both, significant experience working on sort of the strategy and research side of things, as well as the on-the-ground implementation side of things. We have as a sort of a secondee, we have someone from the EPA, Lane, who is a wonderful asset to our team. She brings a lot of the, the environmental lens and a lot of support there as well. So really a strong team and a lot of passion for this and a lot of expertise and ability to support in the design process and the implementation process for these systems. We also have a wonderful group of advisors. Our advisors include folks from across the sort of landscape of different types of different elements you need for putting a reuse system together. So we have folks who look a lot at investment or think about the investment side of things. We have folks who look at it from the large scale business side of things. We have funders, of course, they're key. We have behavioral experts. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Jenna Jambeck's work. She is sort of a very well-recognized scientist who's been working on marine debris for a long time. And also, we have representation from other folks doing really great work in the reuse space. So PR3, Amy Larkin, is running a program to actually create reuse standards to make sure that as these systems develop and grow in different parts of the world, they can be interoperable in important ways. So not the same, but very much aligned along the same principles and using these standards in a way that will facilitate the growth and the connection of these systems over time. And then some of you may be familiar with Upstream. So Matt from Upstream is also one of our board members, and they have a lot of great work that they're doing on reuse, which we coordinate with and amplify. So the work that we're doing is really quite distinct from those organizations, but we see a lot of value in making sure that our work is all mutually supportive and working towards the same ends of accelerating the implementation of reuse. I want to emphasize that this is not something brand new. Everything that's needed to deploy reusable foodware systems today exists. And in fact, there's 167 cup and container programs already worldwide. And what's important about this is that for you to know that you're not guinea pigs. This would not be, it's sort of the first trip to the moon, or something that's just a really big leap in terms of capability and executability. A lot of these programs exist today. What I will say, and if you're interested in learning more about all the different reuse businesses that are out there, the reuselandscape.org is actually a project that we worked on prior to starting Perpetual, and we're continuing to work on it. It is a living landscape of reuse solutions, and all the data here from this slide and a lot more is available there if you want to check out what's happening in the reuse space more broadly. But what you'll learn if you go look at this list of 167 organizations working on reusable cups and containers is that it's very small scale today. So these are tending to be smaller implementations of reuse, because there is this gap of how do we go from I'm a single business and I'm trying to run my own program to I'm a business that's part of an ecosystem that supports this at a larger scale. When we think about how reuse works, we think about it as sort of in two different contexts. We think about closed loop, which is where maybe it's a corporate cafeteria or it's a university, or even just a single restaurant. So this is where you have reusable items and they're being used in one place, but they're not leaving that place at any point in their life. These are relatively easy systems to put in place. It's just a question of, putting the assets in place and getting people on board with using the system. Open loop systems are where you have items being reused across multiple businesses, within a neighborhood or a city or any sort of geographic area. And in this case, this is where the system design piece is really key and really starts to come into play, is because you need to be thoughtful about where are people using foodware? Where will people wish to drop off foodware? Where would be the most efficient places to set up washing facilities so that that foodware can get washed and returned to businesses as quickly as possible and with as few miles traveled as possible or kilometers traveled as possible. And we do see, great examples of success in this space, and things happening at larger and larger scale, but still, wanting to emphasize that this is the harder path, but also it's the necessary path. We're never going to be able to tackle the disposable foodware problem unless we tackle open loop systems. I want to give you just the sense of a little bit of what's happening out there. So here's one closed loop example. This is a company called Our Cup that's working with the city of Seattle and with this series of different music venues. And so they have their system. They're actually using plastic cups. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you like, in terms of material choice. That is a design decision. That's part of the process design. And then these cups get distributed, used, returned, washed, and recirculated. So they have an RFID chip actually embedded in each of the cups so that if people do throw them in the trash, they can wand the trash and make sure that things are not getting thrown away. But again, these are closed systems, so no one is leaving with these cups. They're using them and then they're just being reused in that context. An example of an open loop system is a program that's currently happening in the city of Vancouver with Tim Hortons, a company called Shareware, and actually there's also another company involved called Return It, that their name seems to have fallen off the title of the slide. And in this context, this is a place where when you go into Tim Hortons, which is sort of like the Dunkin' Donuts of Canada, I don't know exactly if there's an equivalent in Bermuda or not, but it's a coffee shop. And you can go in, you either bring your own reusable cup, or if you don't have yours, you can borrow one for a deposit. And then you check it out. When you're done, you bring it back and return it. So this it's happening. You can see these things are happening in the world today, and it's doable. So here I am. I'm a little bit of a broken record. I realize system design is crucial. Some of the key questions, and I'm going to walk through each of these now and just say a little bit more about each of these topics. So does reuse cost more for businesses? I think some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, this all sounds great, but it sounds expensive. And so I can tell you more about what that looks like and how this actually works. Who gets the system set up? So I think, what I'm telling you is that this is a system that you would have the opportunity to participate in. But what does that mean? Who would actually, own the system or run the system, and how does that work? How do we get customers to participate? We are all humans, so we all know that humans do not always do all the things we are supposed to do. And so how do we make sure that we set up a system that's going to really work for human behavior and not work against human behavior or require people to be better than they are? And then how do we make sure that this is actually better for the environment? How do we make sure we're, not creating more trash, but creating less trash and creating fewer impacts across the board, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, litter, other things. One thing that I think is really great in the context of Bermuda is that when we talk about sort of the closed loop and the open loop systems, is that even an open loop system in Bermuda is still kind of a closed loop. We're calling that here the island effect, because you don't have to worry about being part of a metro area where people are going to be driving in and driving out. it gives you a lot more ability to design a system with really strong boundaries, so that you can effectively operate like a closed loop system, and a lot of the advantages that come with a closed loop system, but providing the open loop level of service. So I think that's actually a really interesting and neat opportunity for Bermuda. So cost for businesses. There's two types of costs that businesses would need to think about in this context. One is the cost per use, and this is sort of like the service fee. So the cost per use is as it sounds like, it's the amount you pay per container that you use or per cup that you use. These absolutely can be lower than the cost of many disposables, not all, but many, as long as you have a system that's operating with sufficient volume in an efficient way. The pricing that we see in the marketplace right now is between 13 and 40 cents per use, but keep in mind that this is still almost like at the pilot scale. And so with the level of scale you'd be able to get to in Bermuda, those costs should be able to come down. I hope that giving you some tangible numbers just makes it feel real and tangible and not too daunting. There's also transition costs, and these are the costs that are needed to move to a new system. Things like training staff, if there's any sort of technology that needs to be integrated, incorporating new signage, things like that. Perpetual works with partners to try to find money to cover this. You know, a lot of funders aren't willing to cover the cost of like the ongoing operating cost of a system, but they recognize that these transition costs can be a barrier to adoption. And so there is a lot of interest and I think willingness to fund that sort of getting over that hump. And then in the context of Bermuda specifically, I just wanted to highlight that given the ecosystem that Bermuda already has, I think it's likely that you would be really well positioned to get high return rates and efficient logistics. Another thing we wanted to mention here is that since you're already paying a duty on everything that's coming in, intuitively, again, it sort of makes sense that you'd want to use things as much as possible once you've brought them in. I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, but certainly as you think of them, feel free to bring them up. We're going to discuss them at the end, but feel free to, as I go through this, put any questions in if you're thinking about them. Cost for system setup. And so how does this actually work? There's 4 different types of kind of infrastructure or assets that reuse systems require. You need the washing facilities. This can actually, if you have existing capacity, washing capacity on the island, that can be part of the system, and we can create sort of rules or agreements for accessing that existing capacity, or you can establish new washing capacity to ensure you have enough to cover the needs of the system. You need the collection bins. These need to be in the right places to make it really easy, and they need to be recognizable and sort of very easy for people to engage with. You need some way of moving stuff around. On an island in particular, zero emissions vehicles are appealing here. So cargo bikes or pedicabs, these kinds of things that can move stuff around pretty quickly and easily, especially without adding to traffic and without having any emissions. And then of course you have the items themselves. So cups, containers, pizza boxes, like whatever you end up deciding are the items that you need to have these items be procured and brought into the system. All of these items require investment, but it is an investment. There is a return on investment for each of these items individually, but most importantly, collectively. And so that's why this type of investment can actually work really well to come from impact investors, can be government, reuse service providers, the folks who want to come in and operate the system may be willing to do this investment as part of setting up shop to provide the services. And there may be other interested parties who see the value and are willing to put in money up front and for that payoff over time. Again, as an island, Bermuda is going to be really attractive for reuse service providers because of all the reasons we've already talked about, how it's going to be efficient. A lot of the things that can add cost to a system will not be as big of an issue in Bermuda as they might be in other places. And so that puts you in a really good position to bring the right types of service providers to your community. And I think just another reason to feel like this is very doable. And we know many, both impact investors as well as reuse systems providers. So we're happy to facilitate introductions at the right time. The consumer piece, we've done a lot of work and thinking about consumers and how reuse works for consumers. And there's a couple of things to highlight. One is that the more ubiquitous the system can be, the better. So the more businesses that participate, both that's beneficial to businesses because it gives you volume, which brings the cost down, but it also makes it more and more intuitive and easy for customers to engage. You also need to think about, I mentioned deposits, you can have reminders, there's different ways to work with behavior to make sure people are bringing things back. That's another piece that aligns with cost, but also aligns with people's user experience. You know, how do you make sure they have the best experience if they're hanging on to something for a long time? It's not ideal, and so we want to give them every incentive to bring it back. I think this is something I'm going to say one more time, but the fact that you have a small population and you have people who tend to go to the same restaurants again and again, I think further and reinforces the potential for reuse in Bermuda. Yeah, and then skipping on to environmental impact. So the more cycles you use one of these reusable items for, the lower the overall impact. So I think that probably makes sense intuitively. You're making a slightly more durable item, so you need to use it quite a few more, at least a few more times, and ideally many more times to kind of offset the increased production impact of that item compared to a disposable item. And this means that getting things back is really key. We also wanted to recognize the sort of import and waste infrastructure as key considerations. Things like all the ways, all the sort of cost, both economic as well as environmental, for the end of life handling of items, I think can really tip the balance on making sure that the reuse is actually better than the disposable items. So how Perpetual can help. We are a nonprofit, as I mentioned before, and we are here to facilitate. So what we can do is bring the right people together. We can help you define your reuse system requirements and your governance model. And that's sort of a key first step. What we help you do is ultimately create a kind of a system requirements document that captures all the different design decisions that the participants make. And then we use that. It's almost like you can use it like as an RFP, where you put it out and you say, this is the system that we'd like someone to run. And then program operators are generally very excited to come and compete for that work to be able to run the system. We recognize that another big barrier in this space is actually getting things kind of from, okay, let's do this, all the way to it's up and running. There's a lot of on the ground support that Perpetual provides, and we tend to partner with folks on the ground to make sure that all of that process gets worked through very smoothly. We also, because we're working on this across different geographies, we facilitate discussions and sort of, I won't call them like support groups, but there is a sort of a camaraderie among the different businesses and governments that are working on this across different geographies. And so we create the opportunity to sort of bring those groups together and have those discussions. And then because the behavior piece is so important, we do conduct behavioral research before, during, and after to continue understanding sort of behavioral dynamics. I just have like 2 more slides, so bear with me. I know it may be starting to feel a little bit long, and I want to make sure we get a chance to really discuss your questions. So I just wanted to give you a very quick sense of the process to deploy reusable foodware is about a 12-month process. Now, this can obviously be impacted in things like how long it takes to get things in different places and the procurement process and supply chain and things like that. But in general, the process is you need a couple of months for that mapping and engagement. You go through the design phase, then you really start, making things happen. And so you have a system setup phase where you're getting things really kind of worked out as to what's going to go where, what's going to happen where. You start procuring assets. And then you go into pre-launch and launch. And Perpetual, again, sort of supports every step of the way and ensures that we bring kind of a well-coordinated ecosystem to support this process all the way through to completion and supporting continuous improvement, because we know it won't be perfect from day one. And so making sure that there's that opportunity to continue refining and improving it. I want to emphasize that reuse is collaborative. You've probably gotten that sense so far that this is a system that no individual company can kind of solve on their own. So Perpetual, we bring what we think is sort of needed in this space based on everything that we've observed and the work that we've done around sort of where the gaps are in making this happen. We always work with local NGOs and to make sure that we are leveraging all of their local expertise and engagement with the community and relationships. Government can and should play a role. We don't need them to do too much, but it's great to have them be vocal champions, provide introductions, committing some staff time to just help coordinate efforts, ensuring things like health permits and things like that can be secured. And then really everyone together works to kind of make the system come together as a whole, and commits to sort of being really engaged in the process. If this has resonated with you, which I certainly hope that it has, here are some potential next steps. And I know we'll take some time at the very end to kind of hear from you and what you'd like to do. But I think from our perspective, it would be really interesting to understand is how much interest there is amongst businesses in Bermuda to kind of go down a path of exploring this further. We can certainly help identify potential sources of funding to support the process. We are happy to, we have a very detailed process. So we understand that we've given you just a taste today. If anyone wants to go deeper, we're very happy to set up further conversations to talk more about what this looks like and how it works. And then once we have critical mass of people saying, yes, we want to do this, then Perpetual can actually prepare a very sort of customized proposal for working together. And we're very happy to be in touch at any point. So I'll just leave this up here for 1 second while I know the other panelists are gonna kind of come back and we're gonna do some Q&A. Look forward to answering your questions. We have a website, we're on LinkedIn. We actually have a great newsletter that comes through the Living Landscape. If you just want to keep tabs on all things reuse and what's happening in the space. You can see the archived versions on the website and you can also see them on LinkedIn. So I'm gonna stop sharing the slides and I am happy to hand it back to Katie.
Thank you, Ellie. I mean, that was really engaging and insightful, and hopefully it's planted a seed with the people attending today about reuse systems and how they are a great solution to many single-use plastic foodware items. I think, first of all, before we get into let's do the Q&A. So if Tony and Eric could come back in, that would be great. Thanks. Okay. And I think the next thing is to see what questions have come up. Lynn, are you gonna ask them for us? You need to unmute. Hang on, sorry about the technical.
Okay, I'm here.
Hi.
Our first question regards liability in the case of food poisoning.
So I'm happy to jump in there. One of the hats that I wear is I actually currently sit as the chair of the Committee for the Safe Use of Reusables for the Conference for Food Protection, which some of you may be familiar with or not, but it is the avenue by which food code is updated and issues are brought to the Food and Drug Administration in the US. So we directly work with the FDA. We have a committee. We look at food code and health and safety around the safe use of reusables. That committee is currently working on guidance documents and new food code suggestions for the current food code to be updated to allow for reusables in all FDA food code. What that means is that we look at this question a lot and we look at how we do implement without issues. There are some areas where you have parts of the system that go outside the regular bounds of what food code handles, i.e. you have containers leaving the premises and then being washed potentially off-site and returned, et cetera. So that is a long-winded way to say that the liability issue is going to be handled differently depending on how you design your system. And you might have a system where a business is providing the containers themselves and handling the washing, or you might have a third-party reuse service provider who's coming in and handling all of that. And so I think the liability issue gets discussed there. But even before you get to the liability issue, I think is just recognizing the need to put in safe and sound systems to ensure you're not going to face the food poisoning question in the first place.
Yeah, and also I will mention that we've had some discussions with the health department just in the last couple of weeks, actually, and there are changes coming in the into the regs, because it's been a bit confusing, because as you're more than well aware, there's the bring your own cup, bring your own container scheme that we've been doing for a couple of years has been met with mixed results from, depends on which health inspector came into which restaurant and which day. But I think that that's going to change in the near future. So I think the health department, being part of government and government supporting this, I think that they're going to look to facilitate, changes in regs to make it a little bit less onerous.
I can add one other thought there, which is, yeah, it's different depending on how the system works. So if you have people bring their own items in, generally the way restaurants who do this really well have a standard operating procedure. So they have a way of receiving the item. Like there's an example, a company called Just Salad in New York City. They have everyone bringing their own items from home. So they don't wash the items themselves, and they have a receiving tray. They use tongs. They never actually handle the other person's item. So there's a way of managing the health and safety in the BYO context. And then of course, in the more system, if you have people returning items into a system, even if people have pre-washed it at home, you typically have to wash it again. So that you ensure that it meets the requirements of your system, because that's where you have the quality control is, the washing. So I hope that was a thorough answer to that question.
The last question, typically, do these private entities that do the washing charge a fee for every container, or is it by the load?
Yeah, so typically the way this works is, as a restaurant, for example, you would, rather than paying for your disposable items, you would pay a per item or a per use fee, which can be, I think the examples I gave were somewhere between 13 cents and 40 cents if you just go with something that exists today. Though, as you set up your system, we will have a better sense of what the economics would be. And there's a good chance it could be, even lower than that on a per wash basis. And usually the way that works is you have basically a third-party provider. So we'll call them a reuse service provider. They're the ones who have invested in the infrastructure. They're providing all the assets. They're the ones moving everything around. So they're sort of the invisible hands behind the system, who make sure that every restaurant has clean containers to work with, as they need them. And this other system then does everything else. So this service provider would pick up items out of bins, transport them to the washing facility, get them washed and dried, get them recirculated out to businesses in a timely fashion. And so government doesn't, other than providing permits and things like that, government doesn't have to underwrite it, because it's a viable business. For that per wash fee, they can cover their costs of operations, and they can provide a return on investment on their assets over time. It's not like a super lucrative business, but it's a stable business over time. And as long as they have patient investors on that infrastructure, they can do well. So I hope that answered that question. Government certainly could choose to underwrite programs, but the way I would think about it is, if a government wanted to inject some funding into a system, I would have them provide funding directly to restaurants and other foodware users, whether it's food trucks or supermarkets, to cover those transition costs that we talked about. So helping with staff training, helping with technology integration, anything that is kind of a one-time cost associated with adopting reuse, I think that's a really great role for government to play. I think that governments shouldn't be in the habit of paying for the system over time, unless they're just really committed to doing so, which is great, but most aren't. And so if you don't have a government that just wants to sort of endlessly, push money into a system, the high value role that governments can really play there is the transition cost, so that the system can get up and running and bring those per wash costs down as fast as possible.
One final question. What incentives have you found work the best? Now, I'm not sure whether the question is aimed at consumers or the business owners themselves, but perhaps you could cover both subjects.
Yeah, we can answer for both. Absolutely. Well, I'll start with businesses. So, this reuse systems provide a lot of value to businesses. And, Dagny, I'll name a few things, but I'm happy for you to jump in. I know you've really worked closely with many businesses on this over many years. So what we see is that incentives for businesses can be things like, covering the cost of staff training, how you providing businesses with really tangible types of support that minimizes the barriers to getting started on something like this, helping with signage, helping with knowing that they would have a volunteer in their in their location every day for the first week of a system to help people figure out how this is supposed to work and to stand in line with your customers and talk to them about it and sort of really facilitate that adoption. Incentives, I think, other incentives for businesses would just be making sure that the economics work, and that they're really happy with the way that the reuse process can integrate with their existing transaction process. So making sure it doesn't slow down anything at checkout, all those kinds of things. Dagny, anything else you'd want to mention on sort of business incentives or benefits?
Well, I think that there's some ROI that's a little bit hidden when you have customers returning. You see a lot of ROI in customers that otherwise wouldn't be coming back into the store maybe later that day or the next day, but come in to do a return, and it smells good or that coffee's great, so they buy something extra. So I think there's some ROI in there that acts as an incentive for business as well.
Mm-hmm. Also, often people compare the the cost per wash or the cost per use of a reusable to like the cost for acquiring a disposable, and they're not exactly comparable because there's a bunch of other hidden costs that go along with the disposables, such as handling the waste that they generate, on your premises, using staff time to move them around and, have them, be unpacked or stored in a certain way. So it's always good to kind of take a holistic view of, really comparing apples to apples when it comes to the costs of each system. On the consumer side of things, we've done a lot of thinking and research on incentives. And I think the answer is that you need multiple, there's no one incentive that's going to work best for every person. And so you need a system that actually knits together different types of incentives so that you're kind of really connecting with as many people as possible. So what that means is, in some cases, a deposit system can work really well because there's a value associated with the item, which means if I leave my coffee cup on a park bench, someone else has an incentive to pick it up and take it back. So that's really important. What we're mindful of is that if you're using this for quite a few items at one time, depending on the way you set the deposit level, it can be really expensive. It can actually add a lot of money to your bill. Even if you'll get it back later, that still can be a barrier. It can feel bad to people. And so that can be an issue. If you choose a system where you connect items to individuals, so you have, I wouldn't say an app because apps start to, who needs another app, but there's a way to sort of use access to a shared database, even through just a web portal, to track who has each item, and you get the permission to store it. So rather than paying a deposit, they give you their credit card details or bank details to be stored, and they have permission to charge a penalty after 30 days or after 7 days or whatever if you don't bring the item back. That's a really nice model because people don't have to pay anything up front. They would pay something if they don't return the item, but you need to make sure that the item still has value on the street. So what the trick with that one is that if I've checked it out, I'm the only person who cares about returning that item. So there still has to be kind of a bounty value on the item that gets paid, for anyone who wants to return it. And finally, the other thing I'll mention from a sort of consumer psychology perspective is that the deposit system can feel like a purchase. So sometimes people, when they've paid a deposit on something, they feel like they bought it and then they act like they bought it. And we don't want that behavior because it's really important to get stuff back. And so making sure that if you are using a deposit system, that you're framing it the right way. It's a library book. It's it's something that you really want people to get back. That's key. So happy to go into any number of additional details on that, but I'll pause there for now.
While we're on the subject of customers or consumers, how do you feel is the best way to get customers to buy into this concept?
I know people have heard me talk a lot. I don't know if anyone else, Dagny, if you want to jump in. I think for me, it's never about do your part on plastic waste as the first message. I think the key to getting customers to buy in is that it's better. It's a better experience and it's just as convenient. It's going to keep your coffee hot longer. It's going to keep your beer cold longer. It's not going to leak as you're trying to get it home. Like there's a lot of it's an elevated experience, so people are really can enjoy it better. And it has that added bonus, of like, oh, and I'm not feeling guilty about piling up a ton of takeout waste in my garbage. But what we've seen on the behavior side of things is that that's not going to be just that alleviation of guilt is not enough to get people in. You need to make it just a better system so that people are excited to participate in it. And I just noticed I wasn't seeing all the questions, so I'll be faster now. If we need to get through a bunch of more questions.
Do you have any data on the realistic volume for reuse items? I.e., is it one per person in the population, or what would that volume look like?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily population based as much as it's volume at every restaurant or whoever's participating in the system. What do your daily volumes look like, and then how have you designed your system? So can they keep it out for 5 days? Can they keep it out from 7 days? And so you create a formula on your total necessary assets, essentially looking at that kind of data. Did that make sense? Sorry.
It did to me.
Okay, great.
That ends our questions. Is there anything else we'd like to talk about today? Maybe bring it back to Bermuda and the potential here for these kinds of programs?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of questions as a follow-on, if you don't mind. So, I mean, one thing that you were talking about, Ellie, is that it takes a lot of players to get these systems up, but you're not, I mean, it's obviously possible for an individual restaurant or individual supermarket to launch their own reuse scheme and just keep it, as a private system for their own use, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't mean to say that wasn't the case.
Right.
Yeah, individual restaurants. I think the point I was making is just that the more people participate, the easier it is for consumer. Like it's it gets better and better, right? The value increases, the bigger it gets, but it's absolutely viable at the individual level too. Mm-hmm.
Sure. And there are examples of systems out there that aren't app driven. Does this?
Yes, absolutely. There are plenty of systems that don't use apps.
Right. And maybe you could give an example of because you mentioned Tim Hortons and just salads, but maybe there's another example of a food delivery system that you could give an example of, a provider, a company that's doing this that people might relate to.
It's a great example. I mean, I think there are folks like Deliver Zero, Dispatch Goods. Dagny, I'm sort of looking at you to see. I know you were just speaking with one of them a couple of days ago, but I can't remember which one it was right now. Yeah, there's definitely groups that do the sort of home delivery model. And I think that there's different ways to set that up within the system. So you can have just individual providers that do that within, like you could invite one of these companies to come and run in your community, or it could be part of a larger system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or it can tie into somebody who's doing it. Like DoorDash is working with a provider. So you can actually tie in with whoever's doing local home delivery in your community, and they can play a role in that system, which builds greater efficiencies all around as well.
One of the latest things we've seen there is those companies starting to pick up containers. Like that's a key piece, is people like to have them picked up. So as long as you can do that economically, it's a nice way to keep the containers in the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And presumably if they're picking it up, it needs to be controlled by some kind of app and reminder system. That's probably the most successful way to do it.
Yeah, so if you are using one of those systems where someone has brought an order of food to your home, then that's built into that that part of the system. So then the return would be connected to that same transaction.
Okay.
And I noticed there was some other questions down further we missed.
Okay.
I'm happy to try and answer those now. If I know that some of you have to leave right on the hour, but Ellie, I'm looking at you, but I'm happy to stay if you want for a couple of minutes to handle some of those other questions, or we can try and follow up with them after.
Please go ahead, Dagny.
Yeah.
Well, I want to invite Ellie, I know she's departing potentially, so to
I
thank
think
her
a few
for
more
being
minutes is
here.
fine.
Okay,
I'm good,
great.
Dagny. Thank you, though.
Okay. If I saw this one, if an entity handles the wash, or are they handling the sale of the container? Otherwise, who controls the losses, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is another great question, and it comes into all of these kind of nitty-gritty questions we're getting into. Do you need an app? Who controls the ownership? Who owns the assets? How do you set up your system? And this is really the reason why Perpetual, we are trying to fill this gap, because you're not the only one with these questions, and it gets complex depending on if multiple businesses are playing in one system and they have random items. How do you separate and resort those items? Who owns those items? And so the bottom line is it really comes down to how is a business or even better in our mind as a community, do you build your system, and how do you think about that? So in many cases, it will be the reuse service provider who acquires and owns the assets, being the physical assets, so foodware containers, and they are responsible for the tracking of those assets then, whether you are taking the deposit as an individual business or it's being checked out on an app by the service provider. At the end of the day, they're going to be the ones who have leakage, if they have leakage and they don't have the proper incentives or things in place to get those assets returned. In other situations, maybe individual businesses buy the assets and take the deposits, and out the door they go, then that business obviously is going to be responsible. In some cases, we are working with some governments where the government is more interested in playing a larger public role in these systems and creating sort of city systems that are branded and are interested in owning the assets themselves, and then contracting out the reverse and forward logistics and washing of those. But ultimately in that situation, the city owns the asset. So I would say, I wish I could just give you one answer, or maybe it's nice that there's not one answer. There's many options for many different scenarios. I think the difficult challenge, and I'll just speak to that really quickly. The reason Ellie and I are sitting here today is that we see incremental growth as the most difficult challenge. It's really difficult to create the cost efficiencies as well as the ease of convenience that mimics that of disposables if you're really teeny tiny, and it takes a lot of extra effort. They can only bring it back to one location. Or you as a business have to buy all the assets, have to be responsible for every element of that system, and relying totally on yourselves for the design and everything required. We think that the flipping point of this is going to be at the scale in which you have sort of citywide implementations where businesses can come together and the stakeholders can come together and make the system work at that efficient level from day one. The consumers get an efficiency experience, they can drop it off anywhere, and the businesses benefit from the cost benefit and shared infrastructure value. So I think that's what I would say has been the biggest barrier. Feel free, anyone else. I'm just trying to catch all of them. I didn't see all of the ones at the bottom earlier.
I think the thing is,
yeah.
sorry,
ahead,
Ellie, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
Don't you?
I was going to go to another question. So if you had something you wanted to add on that one.
I think the thing is, in Bermuda, we've got several different models at play, and so it may be that not one system works for everything. And certainly I think that the model where things are picked up would be really interesting to one type of business in Bermuda that is delivering restaurant food to lots of different people, whereas within the restaurants in the city, there may be, of Hamilton, there may be another model. So I think keeping everyone's mind open that there are several different models that might work for Bermuda and for individual businesses is kind of key to finding the right solutions.
Absolutely. And I would say those systems can actually work together, right? You don't have to have a single system solution. So everybody doesn't have to choose an app. Everybody doesn't have to choose a deposit model. Some businesses may choose to offer washing themselves. Others may need the washing. So it's not inherently bound to, okay, now we're all kumbaya and we're in one choice together, but that the system integrates where it needs to bring the ease and the cost.
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing that up, Katie, because I think we weren't trying to imply that there is a single solution. I think that's exactly the point, is that businesses have different needs. And so like the work we're doing in other cities, we expect there to be multiple service providers, and we expect some companies, like I know you guys don't have fast food chains so much there, but some of the fast food chains really want to own their own piece of the system, and they only want to leverage certain shared elements. Like they only want to leverage the shared bins, but they want to do their own washing and they want to own their own items. So that's, I think the whole point of this is to design a system where things fit together, but each business can still do their own thing. So you're that, and I'm sorry if I was sort of using maybe overly general language, but I think that's the point, is that you want the system to operate as a whole, but it doesn't have to be homogeneous. It actually probably can't. I mean, I think we're pretty sure it won't be homogeneous. You need many different ways for different businesses to participate in a way that works for them, but it has to fit together, you know, because otherwise, if you have duplication, if you have like things that are not compatible, then that can kind of burden the system with cost and with environmental impact. And so how do we have the right conversations as each business has their own solutions that they want to bring to make sure that there's compatibility and interoperability, so you can get the benefits of the overall system and all the value that individual companies want to get. I am mindful of time. I wanted to offer 10-second responses to the remaining questions. So how do you shift the mindset? You make it better. I think people want a good experience. They don't want single-use plastics. They want the experience that today they feel they're only able to get from single-use plastics. So we just need to give them a better option. And then I think nobody will be like, oh, boo-hoo, I miss my single-use plastics. They won't. They just want something that works for them. So that's what we need to provide. I think we talked about bringing your own containers. If you allow people to use their own containers, you need special ways of handling them to make sure that they don't contaminate anything. Otherwise, you just make sure you're washing everything appropriately. There's a question on governments introducing tax systems. So I would say the most common thing in this context would be places like Berkeley and Vancouver have a 25-cent disposable fee. So if you use a disposable cup, you pay a 25-cent fee, or you can bring your own reusable or borrow a reusable. I think that's the most common one. I mean, the key is to provide a higher price point for disposability than for reuse for customers, but also for businesses. And then the last question is around finding out how to get some of these special collection bins. That is a longer conversation, but thank you for being interested in that level of detail, and happy to follow up on that. So thanks everyone for sticking around as we've gone a little bit longer here.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you, for joining us today. And you know, I really hope that this is kind of inspiring people to kind of think outside the box and start the conversations about a reuse system, because it takes time to implement, and it's not going to happen overnight. But it is definitely something that I think ultimately will end up being the best solution for Bermuda. The second questionnaire is going to be when you leave. That will send you some questions for us. But I'd just like to close by saying that the team at Beyond Plastic are here to work with Bermuda, whether it's the restaurant, hospitality, marketplace, or retail industries, or the community as a whole. And we want to help navigate this, and because there's an element of chaos that comes with growth and change, and we want to turn it into opportunity. And we really see that what Perpetual is talking about is the opportunity piece. So just email us at info@beyondplastic.bm if you have any questions, you want to learn more, you would like to get involved with Perpetual, or you can visit our website. There's a ton of resources on there, which is beyondplastic.bm, or follow us on social media. You just need to search for Beyond Plastic Bermuda in Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm an optimist, and I would like to kind of end this with the words, it's from actually Socrates said this many, many moons ago. The secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And I think that is the mindset that Bermuda businesses need to think about, is like, this change is coming, and how can we redo our systems to make this change easier for the customers, but also easier for businesses. So thank you all for coming today and being open to these new ideas and to change. We do have more webinars coming up, and so we will be in touch with details about them. But we hope to hear from everyone today, because hopefully this has planted an idea of what might work for you all. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Dagny, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye, everyone.